The wind howled through the bare trees, scattering brown leaves across the quiet suburban street. It was Thanksgiving Day in Ohio, and most houses on the block glowed with warm light, the smells of roasted turkey and pumpkin pie drifting into the frosty November air. Yet on the porch of the Miller family home, a boy stood shivering. His jacket was too thin for the biting cold, and the sneakers on his feet were soaked from the damp sidewalk. His name was Ethan, only 12 years old, and his teeth chattered as he hugged himself, staring at the door that had just closed behind him. The laughter from inside filtered through the walls, his parents, uncles, cousins, all gathered around the long dining table. They were raising glasses, passing trays of stuffing, saying prayers of thanks. Ethan could almost imagine the golden turkey glistening under the chandelier. The thought made his stomach twist, not with hunger alone, but with the sting of rejection. He hadn't expected the punishment to go this far. He'd argued with his stepfather that morning. Something small, something stupid about chores. Words flew, tempers rose, and before Ethan understood what had happened, he was told to get out until you learned some respect. He thought it meant a few minutes on the porch, but minutes had turned to nearly an hour. The cold was creeping into his bones, sharper with each gust of wind. Inside, the Miller family carried on. Mark, Ethan's stepfather, carved the turkey with a satisfied grin. Perfectly cooked, he boasted, ignoring the empty chair at the far end of the table. Linda, Ethan's mother, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Her eyes flickered to the window, catching a glimpse of her son's small frame pressed against the porch railing. A pang of guilt tightened her chest, but she forced herself to focus on the sweet potatoes her sister-in-law was praising. At the head of the table sat Richard, Ethan's grandfather. A retired factory worker with silver hair and a weathered face, Richard had seen hard times. He had known hunger as a boy, had worked through blistering winters when paychecks barely covered rent. Now, in the warmth of his daughter's home, he was supposed to feel grateful. Yet his heart was heavy. He couldn't shake the image of his grandson outside in the cold, while plates overflowed with food in front of him. The others laughed, sipped wine, and shared stories of promotions and new cars. Richard's fork hovered over his plate, but his appetite was gone. Every clink of a glass felt like an insult, every burst of laughter a reminder of what was happening just a few feet away on the other side of the door. "Dad, are you okay?" Linda asked softly, noticing the tension in his jaw. Richard forced a smile. "I'm fine," he muttered, but his mind was far from fine. He thought about Ethan's thin jacket, about the way the boy's hands shook even indoors. What kind of lesson was this supposed to teach? Discipline? Respect? To Richard, it felt like cruelty disguised as parenting. Meanwhile, Ethan's small body trembled harder. His breath came out in cloudy puffs as he whispered to himself, "Maybe Grandpa will notice. Maybe he'll come." The boy pressed his back against the door, listening for any sound of mercy, his hope fading with every passing second. Inside, the smell of gravy grew stronger. Outside, the night grew colder. And in Richard's heart, an old anger began to stir, the kind that only surfaces when history threatens to repeat itself. The Miller dining room gleamed with polished wood and the faint shimmer of holiday decorations. A long centerpiece of golden leaves and artificial berries stretched across the table, while the flickering glow of candles added a cozy warmth. Yet to Richard, everything felt unbearably cold. His fork scraped against the china without purpose. "Best bird I've had in years," Mark declared proudly, raising a slice of turkey on his fork. His deep voice filled the room. "Linda, you've outdone yourself. Perfect holiday." Linda forced a weak smile, though her eyes shifted again toward the curtained window. She saw nothing now, just her own reflection, looking pale in the candlelight. Beneath the table, her hands trembled as she clenched them into fists. She could still hear Ethan's voice from earlier, shouting in frustration, begging her not to let Mark send him out. She had remained silent then, torn between protecting her son and keeping peace with her husband. The silence gnawed at her now, heavier than the food on her plate. "Where's Ethan, anyway?" asked Caroline, Linda's sister, chewing absent-mindedly on her roll. "Haven't seen the kid all evening." The question hung in the air like smoke. Mark's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "He's outside cooling off," he said flatly, as if the matter required no further explanation. Caroline blinked, confused. "Outside? It's 30 degrees out there. He'll be fine, Mark snapped. Boys need discipline. He thinks he's too good to follow house rules. Then he can learn the hard way. A murmur ran around the table. A few cousins exchanged uneasy glances. Caroline frowned, pushing her plate back slightly. Mark, he's 12. That's not discipline, that's... Enough, Mark cut in, his tone sharp. This is my house. My rules. Richard's hand tightened around his glass. He had been trying to bite his tongue, but the words burned inside him. He looked at Mark, then at Linda, and finally at the empty chair meant for Ethan. His heart ached, not only for his grandson, but for the mother who seemed paralyzed by fear of her husband. I don't see much to be thankful for when a boy is freezing while we sit here stuffing our faces, Richard muttered, his voice low but firm. The room fell into silence. Even the children stopped giggling, sensing the tension. Linda's eyes welled with tears, but she lowered her gaze, ashamed. Mark smirked, leaning back in his chair. He'll remember this, Mark said coolly. He'll remember to respect me. Richard slammed his fork onto the table, startling everyone. His old voice trembled with anger. Respect? You think freezing a child earns respect? That's not how you teach a boy. That's how you break him. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Then Caroline cleared her throat, uneasy. Maybe we should just bring him in. It's Thanksgiving, for God's sake. Linda's lips parted, as though she might finally speak up, but Mark's glare silenced her again. Richard's chest tightened at the sight. He knew that look. He'd seen it in men decades ago, men who controlled their homes with fear. And he remembered the boy he once was, standing in the cold because no one dared stand up for him. Outside, Ethan pressed his ear against the door. The muffled argument seeped through the wood, his heart pounding as he realized his grandfather was the only one fighting for him. Hope flickered faintly, warming him just enough to keep standing. But the night was growing darker, and with every passing minute, the chill felt more like knives cutting into his skin. Richard stared at his untouched plate. His appetite was gone, replaced with a resolve hardening like steel. Something had to change tonight. He would not let history repeat itself. The clatter of silverware slowly resumed after Richard's outburst, but the mood at the table had shifted. The easy laughter had vanished, replaced by a brittle silence that even the youngest children sensed. Caroline avoided Mark's glare, quietly tearing apart her roll without eating it. Linda kept her eyes on her plate, her fork moving automatically though she hadn't taken a real bite in minutes. Richard leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the ceiling as though searching for strength. The smells of roasted turkey and spiced cider were nauseating now, tainted by the knowledge of Ethan outside in the bitter cold. Richard's jaw clenched as memories began to resurface. Memories he had buried deep for decades. He was 8 years old again, standing outside a rundown shack in rural Kentucky. His father had locked him out for backtalk, leaving him to shiver on the porch while the family ate inside. The sound of their voices had carried through the walls, warm and cruel at the same time. Richard remembered the ache in his hands, the way he had begged to be let in, and the sting of tears that froze on his cheeks. That night, he had promised himself he'd never let another child suffer like that. Yet here he was, watching history repeat itself with his grandson. He stared at Mark, the smug set of the younger man's jaw, the self-satisfaction in his voice. Richard's hands trembled under the table. Not again. Not this boy. Outside, Ethan rubbed his arms furiously, trying to generate heat. His toes had gone numb, and his breath came in shallow puffs. He pressed his forehead against the door, listening desperately. His grandfather's raised voice had given him hope, but as the minutes dragged on, he feared it wouldn't be enough. Please, he whispered to no one. Please, someone. Inside, the tension continued to build. Caroline cleared her throat again, trying to break the silence. Richard's right, she said carefully. This isn't discipline, Mark. It's dangerous. Kids freeze in this weather. Mark's face darkened. You all think you know better than me, but you don't. That boy's been acting out for months. Skipping chores, talking back, lying. He needs to learn boundaries. If he's uncomfortable for one evening, so be it. Linda finally raised her voice, though it shook. But he's just a child, Mark. My child. The room froze. Linda's words cracked through the air like glass shattering. For the first time that night, she dared to meet her husband's eyes. Mark leaned forward, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his knife. "You're undermining me, Linda," he said in a low, dangerous voice. In front of everyone. Richard's chair scraped against the floor as he stood suddenly. His eyes burned with fury, and for a moment, his presence seemed to fill the room. "This isn't about respect or authority. This is about cruelty. I won't sit here and let a boy freeze to prove your ego right." The children stared wide-eyed. Caroline's husband shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The candles flickered as if stirred by the storm of emotions inside the room. Linda's hands trembled on her lap. She wanted to stand beside her father, to protect her son, but fear held her down like invisible chains. She looked at her husband, then at her father, then finally at the door. Her heart ached, torn between loyalty and love. Richard took a deep breath, his voice steady now, calmer but unyielding. "I know what it's like to be that boy out there, and I'll be damned if I let it happen again." The words hung in the air, undeniable and final. The Miller family sat in stunned silence, while outside, Ethan's small body trembled harder, though hope glimmered faintly in his chest. The atmosphere around the table thickened until it felt impossible to breathe. Every tick of the grandfather clock echoed like a drumbeat, counting down to a clash no one could stop. Mark set down his knife with a deliberate thud, his eyes locked on Richard. "You don't get to run this house," Mark said coldly. "I do. Ethan is my stepson, and I'll raise him the way I see fit." Richard's lips tightened. "A real father doesn't teach a boy through fear. You want respect? Earn it. Don't demand it like a tyrant." Mark's nostrils flared, his chest rising with anger. "You think you know better because you're old? Times are different now. Kids need tough lessons." Richard leaned across the table, his voice sharp as broken glass. "No, Mark. Kids need love. They need safety. That boy is out there shivering while you're sitting here feeding your pride. That's not tough love. That's abuse." A gasp rippled around the table. Caroline pressed her hand to her mouth, while her husband shifted uneasily, avoiding Mark's burning glare. The children stared, wide-eyed and silent, sensing the gravity of the moment. Linda's fork slipped from her hand, clattering loudly against her plate. Her breath came fast, panic squeezing her chest. She had always known this confrontation would come someday, her father's principles against her husband's authority. And now it was tearing the family apart right before her eyes. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Can we not do this at the table?" But it was too late. Mark slammed his fist against the table, rattling the dishes. "You think I'm abusive? You think you can sit here and call me that in front of my family?" His voice rose with fury, echoing through the room. Richard didn't flinch. His weathered hands rested firmly on the table, his gaze steady. "I don't need to call you anything, Mark. Your actions speak for you. And I'll tell you this, if you don't bring Ethan back inside right now, I will." The words cut through the air like a blade. For a moment, no one moved. Mark's jaw clenched as though he might explode, but beneath the rage flickered something else, uncertainty. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not in his own home. Outside, Ethan's small hands had turned stiff and red. His breaths came shallow, uneven. He leaned against the door, exhausted, catching only fragments of the heated voices within. He couldn't make out every word, but he recognized the anger, the sharp tones. He pressed his eyes shut, a tear freezing on his cheek. "They're fighting about me," he thought miserably, "and I'm the reason Thanksgiving is ruined." Richard's voice softened now, though it carried no less strength. "I was that boy once. Locked out, cold, forgotten. And I remember praying someone would open the door for me. No one ever did. Do you understand, Mark? No one." His throat tightened, but he pushed on. "I swore if I ever had the chance, I'd never let another child go through that. Not my grandson. Not anyone." The silence was suffocating. Mark's face hardened, but his grip on the table loosened slightly. Linda's tears spilled over, trailing down her cheeks. Caroline shifted closer to her sister, resting a hand over hers in quiet solidarity. Finally, Richard straightened his back and placed his napkin firmly on the table. "If no one else will stand for Ethan, then I will." His chair scraped loudly as he rose. "And if anyone has a problem with that, they'll answer to me." Every eye followed him as he turned toward the door, his figure tall, steady, and unyielding. For the first time that evening, hope stirred inside Linda's chest, faint but undeniable. And on the other side of the wall, Ethan's frozen body clung to that same spark of hope, praying it would be enough. The porch light flickered above Ethan, casting a pale glow that only made the night around him feel darker. His breath puffed out in uneven clouds, each one vanishing faster than the last as the cold clawed deeper into his lungs. He pulled his thin jacket tighter, but it did little good. The November wind slipped through every seam, biting into his skin until even his bones felt frozen. He lowered himself onto the wooden steps, the icy boards burning against his legs. For a moment, he closed his eyes, trying to imagine he was somewhere else, anywhere else. Maybe sitting by the fire at his grandfather's old house, listening to Richard's stories about working in the factories, about survival and grit. Grandpa always made him feel safe, like someone was really listening. But here, on the porch of his mother's home, he felt like nothing more than a nuisance. Why does he hate me so much? Ethan thought, his teeth chattering. He pictured Mark's angry face, the way his stepfather's voice boomed whenever he spoke about discipline and respect. But respect, to Ethan, was something you gave to people who cared for you, not those who pushed you out into the cold. A tear slipped down his cheek, freezing almost instantly. Is Mom even thinking about me right now? He tried to imagine her stopping the dinner, opening the door, wrapping him in a blanket. But the sound of laughter that occasionally drifted out crushed that fantasy. They were still eating. They were still talking. Life went on without him, as though he had already disappeared. The boy's stomach growled, twisting painfully. He hadn't eaten since breakfast, and the scent of turkey and stuffing teased him mercilessly. His hands curled into fists. It's not fair, he whispered into the darkness. I didn't do anything that bad. But as the minutes dragged on, his anger gave way to something heavier. Shame. Maybe he did deserve this. Maybe he was the problem. Mark always said he was too sensitive, that he acted like a baby. Maybe his mother stayed silent because she agreed. The thoughts sank into him like ice water, chilling him in a way the wind never could. He remembered school last week, when his classmates talked about their Thanksgiving plans, family trips, cousins visiting, big tables full of food. He had smiled, nodding along, pretending his holiday would be just as warm. But here he was, alone on the steps, while his family laughed without him. The lie stung now, leaving him hollow. Ethan buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Please, God, he whispered, his breath fogging between his fingers. Don't let me be invisible. Don't let me freeze out here. The porch boards creaked as he shifted, his body trembling uncontrollably. He thought about running, just bolting down the street, disappearing into the night. Maybe a neighbor would take him in. Maybe someone would care. But the thought of leaving his mother behind held him in place. As much as she failed to protect him tonight, he still longed for her love. That hope chained him to the porch more tightly than any lock ever could. Through the door, muffled voices rose and fell. He recognized one of them, his grandfather's. Richard's tone was sharp, defiant. Ethan pressed his ear closer to the door, straining to catch the words. He couldn't hear everything, but he heard enough. His grandfather was fighting for him. And that flicker of hope, fragile as a candle in the wind, was enough to keep Ethan's heart beating through the icy night. Richard stood at the edge of the dining room, his hand resting on the back of his chair. The warmth of the fire and the golden glow of the chandelier meant nothing to him now. His thoughts were outside, where his grandson's small body was enduring a punishment that mirrored one Richard himself had suffered decades ago. The past was no longer a memory. It was alive again, clawing at his chest. He closed his eyes, and in an instant, he was no longer in his daughter's house. He was back in the hills of rural Kentucky, 1954. The winters there were brutal, the kind that split your lips and burned your lungs with every breath. He saw himself at 8 years old, standing barefoot on the warped wooden porch of his family's shack. His father had shoved him out for talking back when he refused to chop wood in the dark. Richard could still hear the laughter inside, the scrape of plates, the deep voice of his father boasting while his mother stayed silent. He had begged, pounded his fists against the door, cried until his throat was raw. But the door never opened. Hours later, when the cold had nearly broken him, he had curled into himself, promising through chattering teeth that he would never forget. Now, 70 years later, the memory was sharper than ever. He opened his eyes and looked at Mark. The younger man's smug expression, his rigid authority, it was like staring into the face of his own father. The resemblance wasn't physical, but it was there in the posture, in the way he demanded obedience without compassion. Richard's hands trembled as he gripped the chair tighter. "Not again," he whispered under his breath. Caroline noticed, tilting her head. "Dad?" she asked gently, but Richard didn't answer. His mind was elsewhere, torn between past and present. He glanced at Linda. His daughter sat small and fragile beside her husband, her eyes downcast, lips pressed tightly together. He had always worried that her quiet nature would leave her vulnerable to men like Mark. And tonight, his fears had been proven right. Mark raised his glass, ignoring the tension that suffocated the room. "To family," he declared, his grin stretched thin. Some of the guests clinked their glasses half-heartedly, but Richard remained still. The toast felt like poison in his ears. "To family," Richard repeated under his breath, bitterly. "Then where's the boy?" The words weren't loud, but they carried weight. Several heads turned toward him. Richard slowly sank back into his chair, his thoughts racing. His heart ached not just for Ethan, but for himself as a boy. No one had saved him. No one had stood up. And that wound had never healed. But tonight, he had the chance to stop the cycle. Tonight, he could be the voice he had needed all those years ago. Inside him, two forces battled. The old fear that whispered he was powerless, and the hard-earned wisdom that told him silence was complicity. He could no longer pretend to be just a guest at the table. He was the boy's last defense. Richard looked toward the door, his chest heavy, his mind steadying. "I won't fail him," he thought. And outside, though Ethan couldn't hear his grandfather's silent vow, the boy hugged himself tighter, holding onto the faint thread of hope that someone, anyone, would come. The silence around the Miller dining table had become unbearable. Forks scraped against plates without purpose, glasses stood half full, and every eye darted nervously between Richard and Mark. The tension wasn't just palpable, it was suffocating, pressing down on everyone like a storm cloud ready to break. Finally, Caroline could no longer keep still. She set down her fork, her voice sharp but trembling. "Mark, this has gone too far. It's freezing out there. Ethan shouldn't be outside another minute." Mark shot her a glare. "Stay out of it, Caroline. You don't live here. You don't know what it's like to deal with that boy day in and day out." Her husband shifted uneasily beside her, but Caroline pressed on. "I don't need to live here to know you don't leave a 12-year-old outside in the cold. He's your stepson, not your soldier. Discipline isn't cruelty." The words ignited the room. Mark slammed his palm flat on the table, rattling the silverware. "You think you're better than me because you spoil your kids? You think I don't know what I'm doing?" Caroline leaned forward, her eyes blazing. "I think you're blinded by your pride. And Linda," she turned to her sister, her voice softening, "you know this isn't right. You're his mother. Why are you letting this happen?" Linda flinched as though struck. Her hands twisted the napkin in her lap until it tore. Her voice came out small, fragile. I don't want to fight." Richard's chest tightened at his daughter's words. He wanted to shake her, to remind her she had a voice, a duty to her son. But years of silence had carved deep grooves in her spirit, and now fear pinned her in place. From the far side of the table, one of the cousins, a teenager named Dylan, muttered, "It's messed up." His parents hushed him quickly, but the seed had been planted. A ripple of unease spread across the table. Richard seized the moment. His voice cut through the murmurs like a knife. "She's right. This isn't discipline. This is cruelty. And cruelty has no place in family." Mark turned on him, his face red with fury. "You don't get to tell me how to raise my household. You had your chance decades ago, and look where it got you. Divorced, bitter, living alone. Don't bring your failures into my home." The words stung, but Richard didn't flinch. He met Mark's glare with steady eyes, his voice low and controlled. "You can insult me all you want, but don't think for a second it will make me back down. I failed once, when I let others suffer in silence. I won't fail again." The room erupted. Caroline raised her voice, arguing with Mark. Her husband tried to calm her down. The children, frightened, huddled close to their parents. Linda sat frozen, her hands shaking violently now, as though the storm inside her could no longer be contained. Amid the chaos, Richard's eyes flicked to the door. He could almost see Ethan's outline through the wood, hunched and shivering. He imagined the boy's small face pressed against the glass, waiting for someone to choose him. The thought cut deeper than any insult Mark could throw. The family had split into two camps. Those who believed Ethan's punishment was wrong, and those two afraid or unwilling to challenge Mark. The house rang with shouting, but above it all, Richard's voice boomed again, steady and unbreakable. "This ends tonight," he declared. "I don't care whose house this is. That boy deserves warmth, and if I have to drag him inside myself, I will." The room fell silent at last. Every eye turned toward Richard, and in that heavy silence, the line had been drawn. Ethan curled tighter on the porch steps, his small body trembling violently. The night had grown darker, the sky stretched black and endless above him. A few stars pierced through the clouds, cold and distant, offering no comfort. His breath fogged in ragged bursts, and his fingers had turned stiff, red at the tips, almost purple. He pulled his knees to his chest, burying his face against them. Every sound from inside the house made his chest ache more. The muffled voices rose and fell, sometimes angry, sometimes quiet, but never for him. They were fighting, he knew that much. And deep down, he feared it was his fault. Maybe if I'd just kept my mouth shut. Maybe if I'd done the chores without complaining. Maybe they'd want me at the table now. The thoughts swirled relentlessly, carving guilt into his heart. His stomach groaned painfully. He tried to block it out, but the sense of roasted turkey and cinnamon pie lingered in the air, cruel reminders of what he was missing. He closed his eyes and imagined himself at the table, his grandfather passing him a slice of turkey, his mother smiling softly at him. It was a fragile dream, one that warmed him for only a moment before the icy wind ripped it away. The cold pressed harder against him, sinking through his thin jacket and jeans until it felt like knives stabbing every part of his body. His toes were completely numb now, his legs shaking uncontrollably. He rubbed his hands together desperately, blowing on them, but the warmth vanished as quickly as it came. Ethan lifted his head and stared down the street. The neighborhood was quiet, most houses glowing warmly through curtained windows. For a moment, he thought about running. If he could just knock on Mrs. Parker's door 2 houses down, maybe she'd let him in. She had always been kind, always gave him candy at Halloween. But then he thought of Mark's voice, sharp and booming. "Don't embarrass this family. Don't you dare make me look weak." The fear rooted him in place. He shivered harder, his teeth clattering as he whispered into the darkness, "I can't do this. I can't." His voice cracked, a mix of fear and despair. Memories flashed in his mind, warmer times. Summers at the lake with his grandfather teaching him how to fish, the steady patience in Richard's voice as he tied the line. The afternoons at the park when his mom used to push him on the swings before Mark came into their lives. Those memories were like little embers, barely keeping the frost from swallowing him whole. The muffled arguing inside grew louder, enough that he caught fragments. His grandfather's voice, deep and firm, shouting his name. Hope flickered in Ethan's chest, faint but real. He pressed closer to the door, his breath fogging the glass. "Grandpa," he whispered, his lips trembling. "Please don't give up." A sudden gust of wind slammed through the porch, nearly knocking him sideways. He gritted his teeth, hugging himself tighter. His small body was losing the battle against the elements, but his mind clung desperately to one thought. If Grandpa's fighting for me, maybe I'll make it through tonight. Still, the cold was merciless, dragging him deeper into exhaustion. His eyelids felt heavy, too heavy for a boy his age. He forced them open, muttering softly to himself, "Stay awake, Ethan. Stay awake." The door behind him rattled faintly as voices roared on the other side. And though he couldn't know it yet, the moment of decision inside that house was coming closer with every heartbeat. The street was quiet except for the rustle of leaves skittering across the pavement. Most of the neighbors were tucked away in their homes, celebrating with family, unaware of the boy freezing on the miller's porch. But not everyone. Across the street, Mrs. Parker, a woman in her late 50s with a sharp eye and a warm heart, stepped outside to toss scraps to the stray cats she often fed. She pulled her sweater tighter as the cold stung her cheeks. That's when she noticed Ethan, a small, hunched figure curled up by the miller's front door. Her heart skipped. At first, she thought it was one of the neighborhood teens pulling a prank, but then she saw the trembling, the thin jacket, the pale face barely visible under the porch light. "Oh my God," she gasped, dropping the bag of scraps onto her steps. She hurried across the street, her boots crunching on the frozen ground. "Ethan? Honey, is that you?" The boy's head lifted slowly. His lips parted, but no words came out, only a shallow puff of breath. His eyes were glassy, unfocused. Mrs. Parker crouched beside him, horrified at how cold his skin felt when she touched his arm. "Sweetheart, what on earth are you doing out here? You're freezing." She glanced at the glowing windows of the house, the sound of muffled voices rising and falling inside. Confusion and anger tangled in her chest. Did they lock you out?" Ethan tried to shake his head, then nodded weakly. His body shook harder. Her throat tightened. "This isn't right," she whispered. She rose and pounded on the Miller's front door, her fist sharp and unrelenting. "Linda, Mark, open this door right now." Inside, the argument at the table screeched to a halt. Everyone turned their heads toward the sound of the banging. Mark's face darkened immediately, recognizing the voice. "Nosy neighbor," he muttered under his breath. "She needs to mind her own business." But Richard's heart leapt. If Mrs. Parker had seen Ethan, then there was no denying the truth anymore. He pushed back his chair, the legs screeching across the floor, and strode toward the entryway. Linda half rose as well, panic in her eyes. "Mark, we can't just leave him out there with her yelling. People will know." Mark's jaw clenched, his pride pricked. "Good. Let them talk. I don't care what that woman thinks." But Richard's booming voice cut through before he could say more. "You should care, Mark. Because if you won't protect that boy, others will. And I won't sit by while a neighbor does what his own family refuses to." The pounding on the door continued. Mrs. Parker's voice grew sharper, angrier. "I see him out here shivering like a leaf. If you don't let him in, I'm calling the police." The table erupted in gasps. Caroline clutched her chest. The children whispered to each other in confusion. Mark's face flushed with rage, but even he seemed rattled at the threat. Richard reached the door first. His hand hovered over the knob, his pulse hammering in his ears. For a moment, he felt like that 8-year-old boy again, standing in the cold, waiting for someone to care. His throat tightened as he gripped the knob firmly. Behind him, Mark's voice thundered, "Don't you dare open that door, old man." Richard turned his head slowly, his eyes burning with a fire no one at the table had ever seen. "If you want to stop me, you'll have to put your hands on me. And I promise you, Mark, that'll be the last mistake you ever make." The room went silent. Every breath hung, suspended in the air. And outside, Mrs. Parker wrapped her arms around Ethan, whispering desperately, "Hold on, sweetheart. Just a little longer." Richard's hand tightened on the doorknob, his knuckles pale against the brass. For a moment, time seemed to stop. He could feel the weight of every eye in the room on him, the tension so thick it was suffocating. Behind him, Mark's chair screeched as he shoved it back, but Richard didn't wait. With a firm twist, he opened the door. The icy wind rushed into the warm house, carrying with it the harsh truth that none of them could deny anymore. And there, slumped on the porch steps, was Ethan. His small body shook violently, his lips nearly blue, his eyes half-lidded. Mrs. Parker knelt beside him, one arm wrapped protectively around his shoulders, her face stricken with fury and fear. "Dear God," Richard breathed, his heart splitting at the sight. He stepped forward, his boots heavy on the porch boards. "Ethan." The boy stirred faintly, his head tilting toward the sound of his grandfather's voice. "Grandpa." The word was barely a whisper, fragile as frost. Richard's chest ached. He knelt quickly, his strong arms gathering the boy against him. Ethan's body felt terrifyingly light, and the chill of his skin bit straight through Richard's clothes. "I've got you, son," he murmured, voice breaking. "I've got you now." Mrs. Parker wiped a tear from her cheek. "He's ice cold, Richard. I don't know how long he's been out here, but if you hadn't," her voice cracked, anger surging back into it. "What kind of family does this to a child?" Richard didn't answer. He rose to his feet, holding Ethan close to his chest, shielding him with his coat. Every instinct in him screamed to get the boy warm, to undo the damage the cold had carved into him. As he turned back toward the open door, the scene inside froze in place. The family stared wide-eyed, some horrified, some ashamed, others rigid with denial. Linda covered her mouth with both hands, tears streaming down her face as she saw her son in his grandfather's arms. But Mark's face darkened with fury. "Put him down," he ordered, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "This is my house, and you don't get to undermine me like this." Richard stepped into the doorway, his figure looming, Ethan clutched against him. The warmth of the dining room pressed against the icy boy, but Richard's voice was colder than the November night. If this is your house, Mark, then it's one that has forgotten what family means. I won't let my grandson die for your pride. Gasps rippled across the table. Caroline stood quickly, her face pale. He needs a blanket, hot tea, something, now. She rushed into the kitchen, ignoring Mark's sputtering protests. Linda sobbed openly, half rising from her chair, but her legs seemed too weak to carry her. She reached out helplessly toward her son. Ethan! Oh God, Ethan! Richard's eyes burned as he looked at his daughter. He's alive, but only just. If you love him, Linda, now is the time to prove it. The room was silent except for Ethan's shallow breathing against Richard's chest. For a moment, the entire weight of the family's silence pressed down, the kind that had allowed cruelty to fester unchecked. But that silence was beginning to crack, and Richard intended to shatter it completely. Behind him, Mrs. Parker stood in the doorway, her arms crossed tightly. If you think I'm leaving without knowing this boy is safe, you're wrong, she said sharply. If I have to call the police, I will. Enough is enough. Mark opened his mouth to retort, but Richard's glare cut him off. He carried Ethan to the sofa near the fire, lowering him gently onto the cushions and covering him with a thick throw blanket. He tucked it around the boy firmly, his hands trembling. You're safe now, Richard whispered to his grandson, brushing the damp hair from his forehead. You're safe. And for the first time that night, Ethan's trembling eased, just a little. The living room felt like a battlefield. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls, but the warmth of it seemed thin against the storm of emotions brewing inside. Ethan lay curled on the sofa under a thick throw blanket, his eyes heavy, cheeks pale. Every so often, a shiver ran through his body despite the heat radiating from the fireplace. Richard knelt beside him, one hand resting gently on the boy's arm. His weathered face was carved with worry. Stay with me, Ethan, he murmured. We'll warm you up soon. From the dining room, Mark's furious voice boomed. This is ridiculous. He wasn't in danger. He's just being dramatic, and so are you. Richard's head snapped up, his voice like thunder. Look at him, Mark. Look at his lips, his skin. That's not drama. That's hypothermia. You nearly killed him. The words hung heavy in the air. Caroline hurried in from the kitchen with a steaming mug of tea, her face pale. Here, she said, kneeling beside Richard. Small sips. She held the cup to Ethan's lips, steadying his trembling hands. Mark stomped into the living room, his face red, his fists balled tight. You're making me out to be a monster in my own home. He needed to learn a lesson. That's all this was. Richard rose to his feet, squaring his shoulders. His frame might have been old, but in that moment, he seemed larger than life. A lesson? You think near freezing a child teaches respect? No, it teaches fear. It teaches hate. And one day, when he's grown, it'll teach him to despise the man who should have loved him. Linda stood in the doorway, trembling. Her eyes darted between her husband and her father, tears spilling freely. She had spent years swallowing her voice, convincing herself silence meant peace. But tonight, as she watched her son wrapped in a blanket instead of joining the family meal, something cracked inside her. Mark, she whispered, her voice breaking. You went too far. The room went dead quiet. Even Mark froze, staring at her as if he hadn't heard correctly. What did you say? Linda's hands shook violently, but she forced the words out. You went too far. He's my son, and you left him to freeze. Mark's jaw clenched, his voice lowering to a dangerous growl. Don't you dare stand against me in front of them. Caroline stepped forward then, her voice firm. She's not standing alone. We all see what you did, Mark. You can't hide it anymore. The cousins peeked nervously from behind the dining room doorway, sensing the collapse of the illusion they'd grown up watching. Richard took a step closer to Mark, his eyes blazing. This isn't about pride, Mark. This is about a boy's life. And I'll tell you plain. If you ever endanger Ethan again, I'll take him out of this house myself, whether you like it or not. Mark's fists tightened, his body trembling with rage. For a moment, it seemed like he might lash out. But Richard didn't flinch. The firelight flickered across his face, revealing a resolve that could not be broken. Ethan stirred weakly on the couch, his soft voice carrying through the room. Grandpa! The sound shattered Linda. She rushed forward, kneeling beside her son, cupping his face in her hands. "I'm here, baby. I'm so sorry. I should have stopped this sooner." Her tears dripped onto his skin as she kissed his forehead. Mark stared at the scene, his authority slipping through his fingers. For years, he had ruled the household through intimidation, but now the cracks were too wide to repair. The family had seen. The silence was broken. Richard's voice cut through one last time, steady and absolute. "The boy stays inside tonight. End of discussion. If you can't live with that, then maybe you should ask yourself what kind of man you really are." The room was still. The fire popped. And for the first time in years, Mark had no answer. The fire hissed as a log shifted, sending sparks up the chimney. The room was thick with silence, broken only by Ethan's weak breaths under the blanket. Every eye was locked on Mark, whose face flushed crimson as if the weight of the entire family's judgment pressed against him. Richard stood tall by the sofa, his hand resting protectively on the back of it. Caroline lingered near the doorway, her arms crossed, glaring at her brother-in-law with unmasked contempt. Linda remained on her knees beside Ethan, stroking his hair, whispering apologies between trembling sobs. Finally, Mark spat the words like venom. "You all think I'm the villain here, but none of you know what it's like to raise a boy who isn't even yours." His voice cracked with a bitterness that surprised even him. "I put food on this table, a roof over your heads, and still I get nothing but disrespect." Caroline scoffed. "Food on the table doesn't excuse cruelty. You wanted to prove you were in charge, and you nearly froze a child to death to do it." Mark's jaw clenched as he turned toward Linda. "Tell me I'm wrong. Tell me he hasn't disrespected you, lied to you, made you cry more times than you can count." Linda's lips trembled. She had no words. The memories were there. Yes, Ethan had talked back, had acted out in the confusion of adolescence, especially after his biological father left. But never, not once, had she thought those flaws deserved this. Her silence spoke volumes, and Mark's face hardened. Richard stepped closer, his voice low and dangerous. "Don't you dare put this on Ethan. His only crime is being a boy who wants love. If you can't give that, then maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here." The words landed like a strike. Mark's fist shook at his sides. His pride had always been his armor, but now it was cracking, and beneath it, something raw flickered. His eyes darted between Linda and Richard, fury warring with fear. And then, in a moment that stunned the room, Mark's voice dropped, rough and unsteady. "You think I don't know what it feels like to be that boy?" His chest heaved, his voice trembling now. "When I was 10, my old man left me on the porch all night for breaking a window. Said I needed to learn responsibility. My mom didn't say a word. She never did. I froze out there until the sun came up." The confession dropped like a stone into the silence. For the first time, Mark's anger seemed less like dominance and more like desperation. His eyes glistened, though he blinked the tears away before they could fall. Richard's heart clenched. He hadn't expected this. The image of young Mark shivering alone mirrored his own memory, mirrored Ethan now. Generations of pain, passed down like an unwanted inheritance. Caroline's voice softened, though it carried steel. "So you took your pain and handed it to Ethan? That's not strength, Mark. That's cowardice." Mark's face twisted, but he said nothing. His chest rose and fell in ragged breaths, the weight of his past finally exposed. Richard's tone shifted, quieter now, but no less firm. "You could have been the one to break the cycle, Mark. You could have been the man who said, 'It ends with me.' Instead, you let your own scars dictate how you treat a child." Linda's tears streamed freely as she clutched Ethan tighter. Her voice cracked as she finally spoke the words she had held back for too long. "I can't live like this anymore, Mark. Not if it means losing my son. I won't let history repeat itself." The fire popped loudly, punctuating her declaration. Mark stared at her, stunned into silence. For years, Linda had been the quiet shadow at his side, yielding to his authority. But tonight, her voice rang louder than the crackling flames. And in that moment, Mark realized his grip on the family was slipping. Richard's gaze bore into him one last time. "This is your chance, Mark. Change, or lose everything you claim to be protecting." The room hung on the edge of collapse, secrets laid bare, wounds exposed. And in the center of it all, a boy on a couch, fighting for warmth. The very reason every truth was finally being dragged into the light. The fire burned low, its embers glowing red against the darkened hearth. The living room had become a tribunal, each family member silently awaiting the next blow. Ethan dozed weakly on the couch, his breathing shallow, his small hands clutching the blanket as though it were his last defense. Richard stood near the mantel, his shadow long across the room. He looked from Mark, whose pride had cracked open under the weight of his own confession, to Linda, still kneeling beside her son with trembling resolve. Caroline lingered close, her arms crossed, her eyes flashing with anger and pity in equal measure. At last, Richard spoke. His voice was calm, but carried the gravity of a hammer striking stone. Enough of this. Tonight decides the future of this family. No more hiding. No more silence. Mark bristled, but his tone lacked the venom it once carried. You think you can just waltz in here and tell me how to run my home? His words trembled, less with rage than with desperation. Richard stepped forward, his weathered face lit by the glow of the dying fire. This isn't about your home. It's about a child's life, and I won't stand by while you destroy it. I've seen too much of that in my lifetime. I watched it happen to me. I see it in you. And I'll be damned before I let it consume Ethan. The room went silent. The truth was undeniable, carved into every word. Linda's eyes lifted, meeting her father's. For the first time in years, she felt like she wasn't alone. Her voice cracked, but held steady. Dad's right. Mark, if you can't change, if you can't love my son the way he deserves, then this marriage won't survive. Because I won't sacrifice him to protect your pride. Gasps rippled through the room. Caroline pressed her hand to her chest, proud of her sister's courage. Even the cousins, who had been whispering nervously in the hallway, fell silent, wide-eyed. Mark's face twisted, torn between fury and fear. He opened his mouth, but Richard's booming voice cut him off. Listen carefully, Mark. I'm laying it out plain. Either you let go of this poison you call discipline, or Ethan and I walk out that door tonight. And if we do, you'll never see him again. Do you understand me? The ultimatum hit like a thunderclap. Mark staggered back a step, his fists trembling at his sides. You can't just take him away. He's part of this family. Richard's glare was unyielding. Then treat him like it. Because family doesn't throw its children into the cold. Family doesn't silence their cries. Family protects. And if you can't, then you have no right to call yourself his father. Linda's tears streamed freely, but there was steel in her voice now. He's right, Mark. This ends tonight. One way or another. Mark's breathing grew ragged, his chest rising and falling as though the walls were closing in. For years, fear and authority had been his weapons. But now, stripped of them, he stood exposed, a broken man facing the weight of his own choices. Ethan stirred, his weak voice breaking through the silence. I don't want to be outside anymore. The simple words cut deeper than any argument. Richard knelt beside him, his hand resting gently on the boy's shoulder. You won't be, son. Not ever again. I promise you that. He lifted his head, his eyes locking on Mark like steel. So what will it be? Change, or lose him forever? The fire popped loudly, echoing the ultimatum. The family held its breath, waiting for the answer that would decide everything. The room felt like it was holding its breath. Even the fire seemed to hush, its flames dimming to embers as every eye fixed on Mark. He stood rigid, his face pale beneath the flush of anger, his chest heaving as though he had run a marathon. Richard's ultimatum still hung heavy in the air. Change, or lose Ethan forever. The words echoed in Mark's head, colliding with the old voices from his past, his father's booming commands, his mother's silence, the icy nights of his own childhood. For years, he had believed discipline was the only path to respect. But now, staring at the fragile boy on the couch, shivering under a blanket, he wasn't so sure. Linda rose slowly from her knees, standing beside her father. Her face was streaked with tears, but her voice was steady. Mark, I've been silent for too long. I let you convince me that fear would keep this family together. But it's tearing us apart. If you love me, if you love Ethan, prove it now. Not with rules. Not with punishments. With compassion. Caroline stepped forward too, her voice sharp as glass. She's right. This isn't about saving face, Mark. It's about saving a child. Mark's fists loosened. His eyes darted around the room, landing on the cousins peeking from the hallway, on Caroline's husband watching grimly, on Mrs. Parker still standing in the doorway with her arms crossed, ready to call the police if she had to. There was no hiding anymore. No excuses. He looked at Ethan. The boy's lips were still tinged blue, his eyelids fluttering as he tried to stay awake. For the first time, Mark saw not defiance in the child's face, but fragility. Innocence. A boy who only wanted to belong. And in that moment, the weight of what he had done crashed into him like a tidal wave. Mark's voice cracked as he finally spoke. I didn't want this. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. I didn't want him to grow up weak, like I felt. I thought if I made him tougher, he'd respect me. But all I did was hurt him. Richard's eyes softened, though his stance remained strong. It's not too late to stop, Mark. But it starts with admitting what you did was wrong. Say it to him. Not to me, not to Linda, to Ethan. Mark hesitated, his pride thrashing like a wild animal inside him. But then Ethan stirred again, whispering faintly, I just wanted to sit with everyone. The innocence in those words shattered whatever walls Mark had left. He sank to his knees, the fight draining out of him. His voice was hoarse, trembling. Ethan, I'm sorry. I should never have put you outside. I was wrong. I let my anger and my past blind me. You didn't deserve that. Not ever. Ethan blinked slowly, his eyes glossy with exhaustion. For a moment, he said nothing. Then his lips parted in a whisper. I was just cold. Mark's chest caved as he lowered his head, tears finally breaking free. For the first time in years, he looked vulnerable. No armor, no control, just a man weighed down by regret. Linda's hand hovered uncertainly, then rested on her son's shoulder. She looked at Mark, her voice steady. If this family is going to heal, it starts with honesty and love. Nothing else. Richard watched carefully, his heart torn between suspicion and a glimmer of hope. He had seen men promise change before and fail. But something in Mark's voice, in the way his shoulders slumped, felt different. Mrs. Parker spoke from the doorway, her tone firm but less sharp now. Words are good, Mark, but actions will prove whether you mean them. Mark nodded slowly, his face buried in his hands. I know, and I'll prove it. I don't want to lose this family. The fire crackled again, brighter this time, as though reflecting the fragile shift in the air. No one spoke, but for the first time that night, the weight of fear seemed to lift, if only slightly. Richard laid a hand gently on Ethan's blanket, his voice quiet but resolute. Tomorrow will tell us if tonight meant anything. But for now, this boy is safe, and that's all that matters. The room exhaled at last, a fragile peace settling like snow. But the future of the family still balanced on the edge of a knife. Morning light crept slowly into the Miller house, spilling across the floorboards and softening the shadows that had haunted the night before. The storm of anger, accusations, and confessions had left everyone drained, but in the silence that followed, something fragile remained, the possibility of change. Ethan stirred on the couch, his cheeks no longer pale but still flushed from the feverish cold he had endured. His eyes fluttered open, meeting the soft glow of the fire that had burned all night. The first thing he saw was his grandfather, slumped in the armchair beside him, still awake, watching over him like a sentinel. Morning, kiddo, Richard said quietly, his voice rough with fatigue. How you feeling? Ethan swallowed, his throat dry. Warmer, he whispered, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Thanks, Grandpa. Richard's chest loosened, relief washing through him. He reached out, squeezing the boy's hand. You're tougher than you know, Ethan. But you'll never have to prove it that way again. Not while I'm around. Linda appeared from the kitchen, her hair disheveled, her eyes puffy from crying through the night. She carried a tray with toast and scrambled eggs, setting it carefully on the coffee table. Eat slowly, sweetheart, she murmured, brushing her son's hair back. Her touch lingered this time, full of tenderness she had held back for too long. Ethan leaned into her hand, his heart aching with the comfort he had craved. Mark stood awkwardly in the doorway, his face pale, his shoulders slumped. He had barely slept, pacing the house in silence after his outburst of tears. Now, as he watched Linda and Ethan together, shame burned in his chest. He cleared his throat. Ethan, he began, his voice low and unsteady. I know sorry doesn't change what I did, but I want to earn your trust back, if you'll let me. The boy looked at him for a long moment, then turned his face into his mother's side. The rejection stung, but Mark didn't argue. For once, he simply accepted it. Richard rose slowly, his joints aching, but his presence filled the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. Change isn't about words, Mark. It's about what you do from this day forward. If you mean what you said, then prove it. Be the man Ethan needs, not the man who hurt him. Mark nodded, his throat tight. I will. Caroline and her husband quietly gathered their children, preparing to leave, but not before Caroline leaned close to Richard. You saved him last night, she whispered. Don't ever doubt that. When the house finally quieted again, Richard sank back into the chair, watching Ethan eat slowly beside his mother. The boy's small smile returned, faint but real. For the first time, Richard allowed himself to believe the cycle of pain might finally be breaking. Outside, the world carried on. Neighbors raked leaves, the chill of November still sharp in the air. But inside, something had shifted. The silence that once suffocated the Miller household was gone, replaced by fragile voices learning to speak again. Ethan finished his breakfast and curled against his grandfather, his eyes heavy once more. Grandpa, he murmured. Yes, son. Thanks for opening the door. Richard's throat tightened, his eyes misting as he kissed the boy's hair. Always, he whispered. Always. And with that, the long night of cold, silence, and fear gave way to a new morning. One where truth had been spoken, love had been defended, and a boy finally knew he was not invisible.